It was 4 years ago this month, at the height of the pandemic, when then President Donald Trump offered this advice to the American public.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
It doesn't get less staggering, even 4 years later. Tom's out today with a new edition of his book, The Death of Expertise, in which he explains how missteps during the pandemic had everyday people trusting dubious sources instead of trusted leaders. I think one of the problems, Tom, to that moment 4 years ago is it would be very difficult to trust that leader. So tell us about the new edition of the book.
Well, one of the reasons that we decided to go ahead with a new edition of the book is because I was wrong about something that was really important. I thought that a crisis like a war, a pandemic, a depression, but a pandemic, would actually bring people together and would kind of snap us out of this sort of know-nothing, willful ignorance about expertise. And actually, things went in the other direction. That trust in experts got worse, despite the fact that the medical community and the expert community pulled off a miracle by finding a vaccine in a year. One of the few positive things to ever go in Donald Trump's column as president. And so we wanted to update the book because there's just been so many moments of really astonishing rejections of expertise over the past 6-7 years since the first edition came out. But we really thought, my editors and I really thought we had to take a closer look at what happened during COVID. And a couple of things happened. One is that we didn't expect an entire political party to invest in ignorance as a strategy. That just played right into the worst parts of the pandemic, to have the president saying, you know, as we just saw, the president of the United States saying, well, you know, ultraviolet lights and it's going to go away, and disinfectants and so on. But the expert community's made a few mistakes as well. That in this vacuum of leadership, public health officials tried to take the place of elected leaders and to say, well, I guess we should shut everything down. We should wear masks. Maybe we don't have to wear masks. We're not sure when things should reopen. These were decisions that political leaders should have been, but we're not making. And the scientists and the experts put themselves forward for that, and it was a mistake. I mean, it really hurt them. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I talk about in the book that happened during the pandemic that I think was a tremendous mistake were the hundreds and hundreds of doctors who told people to stay at home, not to gather in groups, unless you wanted to go and protest during the George Floyd outrage. And that was a mistake as well, because it suggested to a lot of ordinary Americans that medical advice was too dependent on political orientation. So the experts have things to answer for, but I think nobody has more to answer for than the people who basically weaponized ignorance as a political tool while thousands of people were dying.
Yeah, and Jonathan, and Jonathan Lemire, it was well documented from the very beginning, and you obviously saw it up close. Donald Trump just lying to the American people. He knew how bad it was. He later told Bob Woodward he knew how bad this plague was, that a lot of people were going to die, and yet he starts out in January of 2000 praising President Xi for being transparent on behalf of the American people. He says it's 3 people that have come in, but they're being taken care of. He continued lying to the American people, saying there's nothing to this. You have nothing to worry about. When he knew, he admitted to Bob Woodward that he was lying the entire time. He knew that Americans were going to die and keep dying, but he kept lying because he was afraid it would hurt the economy and he was afraid that if he admitted to people that a pandemic was coming, well, it might hurt him politically.
Yeah, Trump prioritized his own political future, and you got to the heart of it, that he thought a strong economy is what he needed to be able to win a second term, which is why in the early days of 2020, he praised President Xi of China because he still wanted to get that trade deal done with Beijing. He thought that would be helpful to his reelection chances. And then when he saw the market collapse, I was with him on a trip to India at the end of February. I write about this in my book, An Overlooked Moment. It was the first time that Wall Street really plunged because of fears of COVID that was creeping at that point from China across Europe. And he panicked, and we saw panic from Trump ever since through those briefings, including that infamous one where he talked about bleach. And Elise, I mean, it's the death of expertise, to be sure, but it's also the willfully ignoring expertise, that Trump sidelined Dr. Fauci. He sidelined others in the administration because he wanted to be the face of the response because he was so concerned about his political future. And it led to, let's be honest, 1 million Americans died. Untold thousands, tens of thousands of them could have lived had the messaging, had the science been able to take the forefront.
But why did Americans not trust in their institutions, in science? Because of the mixed messaging they were receiving, and they were being told that it was completely insane to assume that this came from a lab, that there was no possibility of a lab leak, that you have public health officials going out trying to stifle any dissent about that consensus belief that COVID absolutely could not have come from a lab. This was a government cover-up of the origins, and I do think that that contributed greatly to then the citizens didn't want to necessarily participate if they are getting mixed messages and they feel like these experts aren't being forthright with them.
You know, Tom, one of the huge problems was this was a pandemic, and that scientists were trying to chase. You know, if you look at the 1919 pandemic, who got hit disproportionately, it was younger Americans. From you know, you read history, and in this, it was older Americans. So it took a while to figure out when we'd get the vaccine, how long the vaccine would keep people safe. And again, so much of what science, the scientists, the doctors, government was doing, they were doing on the fly, trying to figure out where this virus was going to take them next.
You know, a lot of what people thought was the failure of the experts was what we would call science. This was something they hadn't seen before. They were testing out hypotheses. They were having arguments among themselves. The first big argument was, how does it spread? Is it spread through the air? Does it spread through droplets? They got that wrong until other scientists course corrected and said, no, we have to rethink about that. And I think part of the problem is that Americans are used to such a high level, a high standard of living. They're used to living in such a safe environment that when this happened, and you know, people were saying, "What? It's been 6 weeks." You know, this global pandemic is burning the world, and people are saying, you know, they're kind of tapping their watches and saying, "How is this not over?" And science just doesn't work that way, and certainly not when it comes to trying to stop a virus. I do have to take issue with one thing Elise brought up, which was about the lab leak. It's true that a lot of experts dug in their heels on not arguing about this, in part because, to me, and as I say in the book, arguing about where the virus came from is like trying to argue who's responsible for a plane crash while the bodies are still strewn across a field and the plane's still on fire and you're trying to triage the victims. The Republicans went after the lab leak because they were trying to play a game of maybe this was an intentional release. I mean, Tom Cotton says, Senator Cotton of Arkansas says point blank, well, there's a lot of things that I'm just asking questions, you know, the classic, just asking questions about whether this was biological warfare, basically. And so I think a lot of people on the left, including a lot of experts, took that bait and said this is racist and it's silly and we can't have this argument. That was a mistake as well. But the origins, which most of the scientific community is still on a zoonotic explanation that it did come from animals. But that was a really unnecessary debate that was sparked by people who were trying to get the blame off of Donald Trump. And, we're still having that argument to this day, as if somehow that matters about whether or not you should get vaccinated.
All right, the second edition of The Death of Expertise is available now. Staff writer for The Atlantic, Tom Nichols, thank you very much for coming on this morning. We appreciate it.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.